Somewhere in the warm waters between Jamaica and Hispaniola, around the year 1718, a brigantine flying no colors cut through a long Atlantic swell. If you could pull back and see the whole Caribbean from above, like a map unrolling from east to west, you would see the trade lanes first. Dozens of them, drawn by merchant captains over 100 years of trial and error, linking the sugar islands to the American colonies, linking the colonies to London, linking London to the African coast, and linking the African coast back around again in that enormous triangle that moved sugar, rum, tobacco, enslaved people, and manufactured goods around the Atlantic basin in an endless, grinding loop. Those lanes were where the money moved. And where the money moved, the pirates followed. Now zoom in, past the wide lanes, past the convoy routes, past the Royal Navy frigates assigned to patrol and mostly failing, down to a single ship. She is maybe 90 feet long, shallow drafted, fast when the wind cooperates, and miserable when it does not. She carries somewhere between 60 and 100 men, depending on who deserted at the last port, who died of fever since, and who was picked up from a captured prize and convinced, willingly or not, to join the crew. She stinks. Every ship of this era stinks, but a pirate vessel stinks in a particular way, because she is undermanned for her size, because she carries no supercargo to enforce cleanliness, and because the bilge has not been pumped in longer than anyone wants to admit. Below the main deck, past the cannon, past the powder magazine, past the sleeping hammocks hung so close together that a man turning over in the night elbows the man next to him, there is a small enclosed space near the bow called the cookroom. In some ships it is little more than a brick firebox bolted to the deck with an iron grate over it and a copper pot hung from a chain. In others it is a proper galley with a sand-floored hearth and a chimney vented through the deck above. And standing in that space, on one leg and a wooden peg, stirring a pot of something that is technically food, is the man this story is about. He has no famous name. He left no memoir. No ballad was written about him, and no court transcript records his testimony. He is a composite, assembled from dozens of real men, whose presence on real pirate ships was recorded by the only people who bothered to write anything down, which is to say, the people who captured them, tried them, and in many cases hanged them. He is the cook, and his story, if you follow it to the end, tells you more about how pirate ships actually worked than any treasure map ever drawn. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. To understand the cook, you have to understand the leg, or rather, the missing leg, because the two things, the cooking and the amputation, were not a coincidence. They were cause and effect, written into the legal code of the ship itself. Most pirate crews operated under a document called the Articles of Agreement. These were not guidelines. They were contracts drawn up before a voyage, read aloud to every man aboard, and signed or marked by each one. If you refused to sign, you did not sail. The articles covered everything: how prizes would be divided, how disputes would be settled, what happened if a man was caught stealing from the common store, what happened if a man was found drunk on watch, and critically, what happened if a man was injured in battle. The compensation schedules varied from ship to ship, but they followed a recognizable pattern. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, whose crew signed one of the most detailed sets of articles ever recovered, specified that the loss of a limb in action entitled a man to 800 pieces of eight, or 8 slaves, from the common fund before any other division of the prize. Other captains set different amounts. Some paid 600 for a leg and less for an arm. Some paid more for the right arm than the left, on the theory that the right arm was worth more to a working sailor. The specifics changed, the principle did not. If you lost a part of your body fighting for the crew owed you. But money, even 800 pieces of eight, does not last. and a one-legged man in the early 18th century had limited options for employment. He could not climb rigging, he could not haul lines in a gale, he could not man a boarding party or scramble across a captured deck with a cutlass in his teeth. He was, in the language of the sea, unfit for duty. On a Royal Navy vessel or a merchant ship, he would have been put ashore at the next port with his pay and his problem. On a pirate ship, where the crew was the government, a different solution evolved. They made him the cook. This was not charity. It was economics. A pirate crew could not afford to carry passengers. Every man aboard had to earn his share. But the cookroom was one of the few stations on a ship that did not require two functioning legs. The cook did not need to go aloft. He did not need to haul anchor. He did not need to run. He needed to stand or lean in a confined space, tend a fire, manage provisions, and produce something edible from whatever the ship had on board. A man with one leg and a peg wedged against the bulkhead for balance could do that. And so the cook became, across dozens of pirate ships whose records survive, the man who had already given part of himself to the crew and now gave the rest in the form of daily meals. The work was brutal in its own way. The cookroom sat directly over or adjacent to the hold, which meant the cook lived with the smell of rotting stores, bilge water, and whatever was growing in the darkness below the planking. The fire had to be maintained in a moving, pitching, rolling vessel, which meant the risk of burns was constant. In heavy weather, the fire was extinguished entirely, because an uncontrolled fire on a wooden ship at sea was a death sentence for everyone aboard. On those days, the crew ate cold. Hardtack and whatever preserved meat could be chewed without heating. The cook on those days had nothing to do but wedge himself into a corner and wait for the sea to calm. But when the fire was lit and the weather was fair, the cook's day began before dawn and did not end until the last watch had been fed. He was responsible for managing the provisions, which meant knowing how much salt beef remained in the cask, how much dried peas were left in the barrel, how many days the water would last before it went green, and how to stretch what he had when the next prize might be a week away or a month. This was not a minor responsibility. A miscalculation in the stores could mean starvation, and starvation, more than any Royal Navy broadside, was the thing that ended pirate voyages. The standard ration on a pirate ship, when supplies were adequate, was not much different from what a man might eat on a merchant vessel or a naval ship of the same period. The backbone was salt beef or salt pork, whole joints of meat packed in barrels of coarse salt, sometimes years before they were eaten. The salt preserved the meat, but it also turned it into something closer to leather than food. Before it could be cooked, it had to be soaked in fresh water for hours, sometimes overnight, to draw out enough salt to make it chewable. The cook managed this process. He kept a soaking barrel, he rotated the meat, he judged when it was ready. Then there were the dried peas. Peas were a staple of maritime diet for the simple reason that they kept. Packed dry in barrels, sealed against moisture, they could last months or years without spoiling. Cooked into a thick porridge or a soup, they provided bulk and calories. The cook boiled them, sometimes for hours, sometimes with a piece of the salt meat thrown in for flavor, sometimes with nothing but water and whatever spice or seasoning he could find. On a good day, peas and salt pork cooked together for long enough produced something that, if you were hungry enough, tasted almost like food. The men called it peas porridge. It was the same thing their grandfathers had eaten and their grandsons would eat. It never changed. Hardtack was the bread. A dense, dry biscuit baked from flour, water, and sometimes a little salt, then baked again until every trace of moisture was gone. It was designed to last indefinitely, and it did. The cook's role with hardtack was less about preparation and more about damage control. In warm climates, weevils infested the biscuit within weeks of leaving port. The larvae burrowed into the dense crumb and lived there, eating and breeding and leaving the biscuit honeycombed with tunnels. Experienced sailors tapped their biscuit on the table before eating it to knock the weevils out. Others ate in the dark so they would not have to see what they were chewing. The cook could do nothing about the weevils except keep the casks as dry as possible and rotate the stock so that the oldest biscuit was eaten first before it became more insect than flour. Water was the cook's other constant worry. Fresh water stored in wooden casks went bad faster than almost anything else on the ship. Within days, the water developed a greenish tinge. Within weeks, it grew a slime on the surface and took on a taste that sailors described in terms that do not bear repeating. The cook used this water for cooking because he had no alternative. Boiling it killed whatever was growing in it, or at least made it less obviously alive. For drinking, the crew preferred rum mixed with water, which is how grog became the standard drink of the Age of Sail. The alcohol did not sterilize the water, but it masked the taste, which was enough. When a prize was taken, the cook's life changed dramatically for a short period. Prize ships carried provisions, and the first thing a pirate crew did after securing a capture was raid the stores. Fresh food appeared: flour that had not yet gone weevil, cheese, butter, onions, sometimes livestock, chickens, or a goat penned on the deck of the captured vessel. The cook suddenly had materials. On those days, he could produce something that resembled an actual meal, and on those days his status aboard the ship rose accordingly. Men who had spent weeks eating gray peas porridge and wormy biscuit suddenly found themselves eating fresh bread fried in butter, or stew made with real vegetables, or roasted chicken, and the man who made it possible was the one-legged man in the cookroom. This is where the cook's real power began to show itself. On a pirate ship, authority was distributed differently than on any other vessel of the period. The captain held command in battle and during chase, but in all other matters, the crew voted. The quartermaster, elected by the crew, handled the daily management of the ship, the discipline, the division of provisions, the settlement of disputes. The cook answered to the quartermaster in theory, but in practice, the cook answered to hunger, and hunger answered to no one. A cook who could stretch provisions, who could make bad stores edible, who could turn a lucky prize into meals that kept morale high for days afterward, was worth more than his share. The crew knew it, the quartermaster knew it, the captain knew it, and the cook knew it. This gave him a form of influence that no other disabled member of the crew possessed. He could not fight, but he could feed. And feeding, on a ship where the next meal was never guaranteed, was a form of power that operated below the level of formal authority but above the level of everything else. There are trial records from the period that mention the cook in passing, usually to establish that he was present on the ship during specific acts of piracy. These mentions, brief as they are, reveal something about his position. In several trials, the cook was treated differently from the rest of the crew. At the mass trial of Bartholomew, Robert's crew, in 1722, which was one of the largest pirate trials ever held, certain men were acquitted on the grounds that they had been forced into service and had served only in non-combatant roles. The cook was frequently cited as one of these non-combatants. He had not boarded prizes, he had not fired cannon, he had stood in the cookroom and done his work. Whether this defense was truthful in every case is debatable. But the fact that it was used and that courts accepted it tells you something about how the cook's role was understood, even by the people prosecuting piracy. It also tells you something about the strange legal space that pirates occupied. A pirate ship was, in its own way, a functioning society with its own laws, its own economy, its own welfare system, and its own division of labor. The cook was a product of that system. He existed because the articles created a compensation structure for injury, because the compensation created men who could no longer perform their original duties, and because the ship still needed those men to contribute. The cook was not a luxury. He was a structural necessity, generated by the internal logic of how pirate crews organized themselves. And that organization was, in many ways, more sophisticated than what existed on legitimate vessels of the same period. On a Royal Navy ship, the cook was typically a pensioner. Greenwich Hospital supplied disabled sailors to fill galley posts across the fleet. These men received their pension plus cook's wages, and the Navy received a warm body to stand in the galley. The food was produced according to regulations that specified quantities and ration days. Whether the result was edible was considered a secondary matter. Pirate cooks operated under no such system. There was no hospital sending them. There was no regulation telling them what to serve and when. There was only the crew, the provisions, and the expectation that something would be ready when the watch changed. He could not requisition supplies from a dockyard. He worked with what the ship had, and what the ship had was whatever had been taken from the last prize, whatever had survived from the last provisioning stop, and whatever was still recognizable in the casks. Pirate cooks became by necessity experts in preservation. They knew which foods lasted and which did not. They knew that limes and citrus, when available, kept the crew from getting sick with the bleeding gums and loose teeth that we now know as scurvy, though they would not have called it that or understood the mechanism. They knew that turtle meat, abundant in the Caribbean, could be kept alive on deck for weeks if the turtles were flipped on their backs, providing a source of fresh protein when everything else had gone to salt and weevil. They knew that coconut water, scooped from a fresh coconut, was cleaner than anything in the water casks. They knew that fish caught fresh over the side could be fried and rendered fat from the salt pork and served with hardtack softened in the drippings, and that this meal, simple as it was, could make men feel like they had eaten something real. Turtle was particularly important, and the cook's relationship with turtle tells you something about Caribbean piracy that the treasure and swordfight version of the story leaves out. The Cayman Islands, which today are known for offshore banking and luxury resorts, were known in the early 18th century for one thing: turtles. Green sea turtles nested on the beaches in enormous numbers, and pirate crews stopped there specifically to hunt them. A single green turtle could weigh 300 pounds or more. Flipped on its back and kept wet with seawater, it would stay alive for weeks. A crew that took on a dozen turtles at the Caymans had fresh meat for a month. The cook managed this supply. He decided when a turtle was killed, how it was butchered, and how the meat was distributed. He boiled the shell and the cartilage into a soup that was rich and fatty and bore a distant resemblance to what, a century later, would become a fashionable dish in London dining rooms under the name turtle soup. The cook also managed the one substance on the ship that every man cared about more than food. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Rum. On most pirate ships, the daily rum ration was the quartermaster's responsibility, but the cook often controlled the physical supply because the rum casks were stored near or in the cookroom. This gave him leverage. Not official leverage, not leverage he could exercise openly, but the quiet leverage of proximity. The man who stands between a crew and its rum is a man who is treated with a certain degree of respect regardless of how many legs he has. There is a moment in the life of every pirate ship that tested the cook more than any battle or storm. It was the long, empty stretch between prizes, when the provisions ran low, when the water went foul, when the hardtack was more weevil than biscuit, and when the crew, hungry and bored, and starting to turn on each other, looked to the cookroom for something, anything, to eat. These stretches could last weeks. In the worst cases, they lasted months. Ships that sailed the Atlantic crossing, looking for prizes on the African coast or the Indian Ocean, sometimes went 60 or 70 days without sighting another vessel. On those passages, the cook performed a kind of alchemy. He took the worst of what the ship had and made it survivable. He scraped the mold off the cheese and cut away the green parts. He soaked the salt meat for an extra day, changing the water twice, trying to make it soft enough to chew. He boiled the weevily biscuit into a porridge so that the texture disguised the contents. He rationed the dried peas down to a few spoonfuls per man per day, cooked into a thin broth that provided warmth if not satisfaction. And when even that ran out, when the provisions were truly gone, the cook did something that no other man aboard could do. He stopped. He put out the fire, he closed the cookroom, and he waited. Because there was nothing left to cook, and a crew that had no food had only two options: find a prize or find a port. The cook's empty galley was the final argument in every debate about where to sail next. This is where fiction and history cross paths. In 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island, and the most memorable character is not the young hero Jim Hawkins, but the ship's cook, Long John Silver, a one-legged man who controls the crew through charm, intelligence, manipulation, and food. Stevenson did not invent this character from nothing. He had access to the published accounts of real pirate trials and real pirate crews. And when he needed a villain who could move through the social structure of a ship with ease, who could command loyalty without holding formal rank, he chose the cook. Stevenson understood something that the historical record confirms. The cook was the perfect position for a man who wanted influence without visibility. He fed every man on the ship, which meant every man owed him something. He controlled access to provisions, which meant he knew exactly how desperate the ship was at any given moment. He was excused from combat, which meant he survived fights that killed others. And he was disabled, which meant he was underestimated. The historical record is frustratingly thin on individual cooks. We know they existed because the trial transcripts mention them. We know they were often disabled because the articles specified their route from fighting man to galley. We know they were treated as non-combatants because courts distinguished between men who fought and men who cooked. But we do not know their recipes. We do not know their names, in most cases. We do not know whether they were good at their jobs or terrible, whether they took pride in feeding the crew or simply endured it, whether they dreamed of returning to two-legged life or had made their peace with the peg and the pot. What we can do is reconstruct their world from the edges, from the provision lists that survive in port records, from the descriptions of meals in captive accounts, men taken by pirates and later released who described what they were fed, from the medical records that document the diseases of poor diet, scurvy and malnutrition and dysentery that tell us what happened when the cook's best efforts were not enough, and from the articles themselves which tell us that the pirates understood something that took the rest of the world another century to articulate, that a man who is injured in service is owed something by the community he served, and that the debt is not paid with a lump sum and a discharge. It is paid by giving him a place, a role, a way to contribute, and a reason to stay. The cook's galley was small. On most ships of this period, it measured perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, sometimes less. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man had to stoop. The hearth was brick or stone, mortared to an iron plate that was bolted to the deck beams to prevent it from shifting in heavy seas. Sand covered the floor around the hearth to catch sparks and spilled grease. The chimney, when there was one, was a copper or tin pipe that ran up through the deck and vented above the waterline. In rain, water came down the pipe and hit the fire, filling the cookroom with steam and ash. The cook worked in this space for hours at a time, balancing on his peg, bracing against the roll of the ship, reaching across the fire to stir a pot that weighed as much as he did when it was full. His tools were simple: a large copper or iron pot, sometimes 2, a ladle, a knife, a cleaver for butchering, a gridiron for roasting meat over the coals when meat was available, a pestle for grinding dried peas or biscuit into powder, a bucket for soaking salt meat, and the fire itself, which was both his primary tool and his greatest danger. Fire on a wooden ship was a constant anxiety. The cook was expected to manage it with absolute discipline. The fire was lit at designated hours and extinguished at others. In battle, the fire was put out immediately, because a cannonball hitting a lit galley could set the whole ship ablaze. After battle, the cook's first job was to get the fire going again, because a crew that had just fought wanted food, and the cook who had it ready fastest earned the most goodwill. There is one more thing about the cook that the popular image of piracy never includes, and it may be the most important thing of all. The cook was the one man on the ship who could not leave. Every other member of the crew had the theoretical option of deserting. At any port, at any prize, a man could slip away, change his name, find a merchant ship that did not ask too many questions, and start again. Pirates did this constantly. Crews were fluid, but the cook, with his missing leg and his peg and his limp, was identifiable. A one-legged man asking for berth on a merchant ship invited questions. A one-legged man in a port town attracted attention. Every magistrate in the Caribbean knew that one-legged sailors came from one place, pirate crews that compensated their wounded. The cook was a man carrying his own arrest warrant in the shape of his body. The cook could not hide what he was. His injury marked him as surely as a brand. And so he stayed. He stayed because the ship was the only place where his injury was not a mark of suspicion, but a mark of service. He stayed because the crew that had taken his leg also gave him his livelihood. He stayed because the cookroom, small and hot and stinking, was the one place in the world where a one-legged man was not pitied or feared or arrested, but needed. And every morning he lit the fire. And every evening he put it out. And in between, he fed the men who had made him what he was. The Caribbean map, seen from above, is a scatter of islands in a warm sea. The trade lanes cross it like threads in a web. The winds blow predictably. The currents run in patterns that a good navigator could read like a road. And somewhere on that map, on any given day between roughly 1,690 and 1,730, there was a ship with a one-legged man in the galley, stirring a pot, counting the biscuit, checking the water casks, and wondering how long the provisions would last. He did not choose this life. The life chose him in the form of a cannonball or a musket ball or a falling spar or any of the 100 ways a man could lose a leg on a ship in the early 18th century. And once the leg was gone, the path was set. The articles guaranteed his compensation. The crew guaranteed his place. The cookroom guaranteed his purpose. And the sea, indifferent to all of it, guaranteed that the work would never end. If you look at the trial records from the Great Age of Piracy, the period between roughly 1716 and 1726 that historians call the Golden Age, you will find the cook mentioned again and again, not by name, usually, not with any particular attention, just a reference, in the testimony of a witness or the deposition of a captured sailor, that the cook was aboard, that the cook served food, that the cook was one-legged, that the cook did not participate in the fighting. These references are almost always incidental. The court was not interested in the cook. The court was interested in who fired the cannon, who boarded the prize, who hoisted the black flag. The cook was background, furniture, a detail mentioned in passing. But if you collect those passing mentions and lay them side by side, a picture forms, a picture of a man who was present at every meal, every crisis, every decision, every argument, every moment of boredom, and every moment of terror, and who witnessed all of it from his small hot room near the bow of the ship, stirring his pot, counting his stores, and keeping the one thing going that no one else could provide. The fire in the cookroom was the heart of the ship. Not the captain's cabin, not the helm, not the powder magazine. The fire, because the fire meant food, and food meant survival, and survival meant another day to chase the next prize, to split the next haul, to drink the next ration of rum, and to do it all again tomorrow. The cook kept the heart beating, and when the ship was finally taken, when the Navy caught up or the crew surrendered or the vessel was wrecked on a reef in the Bahamas, the cook was the last man to leave the galley, because there was always one more pot to empty, one more fire to put out, one more cask to check. The habits of his duty outlasted the ship itself. In the trial, he would stand in the dock with the rest of the crew on his one leg, and he would say what every cook said, that he had not fought, that he had not boarded, that he had only cooked, and sometimes the court believed him, and sometimes it did not. But either way, the cook had done the one thing that mattered. He had fed the crew. From the first day of the voyage to the last, through calm and storm, through plenty and famine, through battle and boredom, he had kept the fire lit, he had stretched the provisions, he had turned salt and weevil and green water into something that kept men alive. That is not the story you hear when someone mentions pirates. You hear about Blackbeard and his smoking beard. You hear about Calico Jack and Anne Bonny. You hear about buried treasure and walking the plank and the Jolly Roger snapping in the wind. But none of those stories happen without the cook. None of them happen without the one-legged man in the galley, balancing on his peg, stirring his pot, watching the fire, and keeping the whole enterprise alive, one meal at a time. The maps are still there. The trade lanes are still drawn. The islands are still scattered across the warm blue water. And if you know where to look, in the port records and trial transcripts and provision lists of the early 18th century, you can find him. Not by name, never by name, but by the shape he left behind. The cook.